All right.
Just go for it.
Cool. Well, I am Michael Rawlins. I currently teach here at Archie Williams High School in Marin County. But I started my career more in the environmental sciences and forestry in particular. And, I've always, I sort of knew that I wanted to be in the environmental field from pretty early on after college, when I was exposed to forestry, and sort of the education and working with kids piece kind of came later. Actually, I sort of came to that through coaching track and field. I was working over in Albany, and I sort of realized, I was like, wow, this is kind of fun. And I like working with kids. So I started substitute teaching over there. And then I just sort of realized that I was like, man, this is something I could do all the time. So, but before I sort of settled into teaching, I bounced around between forestry, and I worked as a personal trainer and physical therapy for a little while, and just kind of odd jobs, just kind of to pay rent around the East Bay and things like that. So, but very glad to have landed in CEDIS currently, which is the Student Environment Academy here, and we based around environmental science. I do the social studies side of it. I was actually an anthropology major in college at Berkeley, where I got exposed to all these things. And when I was first there, I was in the sociocultural anthropology, and I minored in forestry. And I was actually looking at doing like cultural, sort of like interpretation almost, or sort of like working as like a liaison between different stakeholders around forestry projects. So, sort of meeting with the logging companies and the Forest Service and the nat parks and local residents, and trying to get everybody like on the same page, sort of speaking the same language around science. But it turns out, as I was looking at jobs like that, there's only like a few people that do that all across the state of California. Yeah. I was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that job. So I sort of went into the other forestry gigs, and I think we'll hit on it when we get to some of the other questions. But, I worked in several different fields of forestry, whether that was research, commercial, or private. And,
yeah, so would you say like your collective experience of working, throughout your life kind of led you to where you are now? I suppose like combinations of different elements of different parts of your work in your life have kind of led you to see this?
Yeah, absolutely. And it does feel like sort of like a culminating moment. Like I feel like I found my place, where it sort of combines all of my different passions, and it's in a place that I love to be. And I like the coworkers that I work with, and the students are great. And so it sort of felt like I was, didn't really know that's where I was heading, but it all sort of came together, and I've sort of ended up here. And, just love it. I really do feel like I get to combine all of my passions, and I get to work with youth that sort of keep me feeling young and energetic. I get to be outside a lot, but also I get to balance the academics with that. So it's a nice it's been quite the journey.
Yeah, awesome. I, from personal experience as well, can say CEDIS is wonderful.
So what makes environmental science special to you? What was like the thing that was like, this is what I want to do with my life?
Yeah, and it's, I'm not super formally trained in environmental science. It's sort of, I've worked in it, and I work in it now. And so it's like a lot of it's just been gaining experience through doing it, and just kind of doing environmental science. But I think really what makes it so meaningful for me is that when I was a teenager, even younger than you guys, I sort of was realizing, some of the climate change and some of the environmental problems were becoming really clear. And I just felt like our society wasn't really taking action on these problems. And that sort of, and so it spurred me. It's like, all right, like we should be doing something about this. So I feel like I should learn more about it. And I sort of approached that from the cultural side of things. Like, what do we need to do about humanity and sort of our civilizations and our culture? What about our culture leads us to sort of make these choices? But then as I sort of got into it more, I realized that I was just focusing on the negative and didn't really understand the science of it. I was just like getting depressed. And realized that when if you want to switch from that negative mindset into a more positive problem solving mindset, you have to understand the science of the problems in order to fix them, rather than just sit around and complain, right? So I think that was sort of an eye-opening experience for me in college. I was just like, wait, if we can't just sit around here and doom and gloom and despair. It's like, if you actually want to work on something positively, you got to get into the science and the nitty gritty. And I think that's where I sort of like changed gears and sort of said, okay, well, let's work on, getting, I started with outdoor ed in fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, right? Let's get young kids passionate about this and give them some of the basic scientific vocabulary, so as they get older, they can explore, those passions and interests and sort of work towards it. So I sort of reoriented towards, like, instead of complaining about it, like, let's get, a new generation of people that's going to be running the world in, a couple decades down the road, and let's get them sort of versed, and myself versed, right, in environmental science. Kind of what I was saying before, it's like, if we can get people that think they all disagree because of politics or whatever that issue, if we can sort of bring people together and get them speaking this common language of environmental science, all of a sudden some of those differences can melt away.
Yeah, that's interesting that you like had that as a teenager, because I feel like us our age, everyone's kind of like, we're the generation to change things, and like we're the ones realizing. But it's very interesting that like you as a teenager had the same fears and like doubts that we have right now.
Yeah, and I think
I can thank my dad for that. My dad was a nuclear physicist, and was just, was way ahead of the curve on talking about climate change and global warming and stuff. So I got sort of indoctrinated into some of that mindset sort of ahead of a lot of my peers. But that was part of that, he was bringing a little bit more of that doom and gloom perspective. So I had to grow out of it and get back to like a more sort of positive mindset.
Yeah, 100%. So I think that, now that you have become a teacher and an educator of other people, and I know that you said you didn't start off with environmental science as like either your main subject or what you were completely focusing on initially, but you developed into that currently or now. But before or even now that you have all this experience in the environmental science world and forestry with whomever that you've met, like, do you want to speak a little bit more to the social justice and like environmental racism side of this issue? Because, we know that natural disasters and all sorts of climate issues totally affect the marginalized groups a lot more than the privileged ones. Yeah.
And I mean, and that's really the central crux of it right there, right? It's just like, and, over time, there's been plenty of instances where sort of the environmental movement and the social justice movement have been at odds, right? They're not really working together, and sort of even disagreeing on certain issues. And I think that it's really important to shift that conversation, right? It's just like, social justice is environmental justice. Environmental justice is social justice, right? It's like, and I think that perspective is coming more to the forefront. But I mean, simply around like, and take the issue of like population, for example, right? It's like environmentalists over the past many decades have sort of taken positions that, are, that don't necessarily jive with the social justice movement on that topic, right? And it's really more about, it's like, well, we need to reduce population. And it's like, well, is it really about how many people we have, or is it the bad distribution of how much different people consume, right? It's just like, we have folks that, are consuming 20 times or whatever amount of times of other folks. And so it's like, is it that there's like, that's just an example of this tension, right? That it has existed in the past between the environmental movement and social justice. But I think we're sort of coming around to this more holistic, and I like to use the term environmental justice, right? Because you kind of get both of those concepts in there, and that we really need to be looking at the, the equitable sort of distribution of climate solutions. Because it's like, basic supply and demand. One of the best ways to reduce the consumption of certain resources like gasoline and fuel is to make them more expensive, right? It's like, let's crank up gas prices. But now we have low-income people that can't get to work, right? And so it's like, there has to be transit solutions that are provided, or like we have to do things that are going to uplift our most vulnerable populations, right? Because a lot of, like, as you said, the impacts of natural disasters and climate change and rising prices and all these things, it's going to hit our most vulnerable populations the most. So it's like, environmental solutions really have to come hand in hand with, government programs to sort of a social safety net, right? To sort of make sure that people can get food, shelter, can get to work, transportation, right? And so it's like we got to build solutions that really take both sides into account, the human and the environment.
Definitely. Yeah. Did any of like your past work experience help shape like these views, or like how you view environmental justice, social justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think the social justice element really came more for me when I got into education. When I was working in the forestry field, I didn't encounter it as much. It wasn't something that was really on the forefront. I was really much more ingrained in the environmental issues there. Yeah. And sometimes, in terms of commercial forestry, I worked for a little bit I was just cruising timber for a logging company, right? And so it's like that was not good for the environment or people, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I was lucky enough in some of my other jobs to actually be doing forestry work that was really about the health of the forest and wildfire management, right? Which is such a huge issue in California. So I was lucky, I've kind of been on both sides of that there, but I really think the social justice piece came more from me when I got into education. And it was, and so as we blend environmental science and social studies in CDIS, that's where that we have that kind of time and space to really think about the economics of a thing, of these environmental policies and who that impacts, or the government policies that need to be in place and how that sort of works on the social justice side of things. And definitely when you get into the wildfire stuff and some of the indigenous perspectives too, that's where we see a lot of this sort of social justice and sort of indigenous knowledge and wisdom that needs to be sort of brought back into the discussion, or like sort of Western science and fire suppression and our practices in the Forest Service and wildfire management, have really strayed so far from indigenous wisdom. And thankfully now that wildfires are, not thankfully, but the wildfires are bad, but because wildfire has become such an issue, people are a little more ready to listen and hear the indigenous perspective. So definitely see that sort of social justice element there of like respecting the peoples that have been on this land for thousands of years.
Yeah, and it's crazy because their practices like were illegal for a while, and now like we're finally starting to listen and try and like work together to
and it's also totally, and it's also like a little upsetting that we have to come to the point where people and millions of acres of wild land are being burnt down by wildfires to finally come to the reality that maybe we should take knowledge or maybe we should borrow knowledge from indigenous groups and see what their perspectives are, because they were the first group of people to ever implement controlled burns to help regenerate forest growth and burn away all the leaves off the forest floor to prevent future massive wildfires, which is kind of the issues that we're facing today in California. But I guess using all this knowledge that you've accumulated and this idea that in CDIS, social justice and environmental justice is intertwined with the social studies course that you teach, what is one of your favorite aspects of being able to kind of mend courses at your will, if you will, to incorporate indigenous perspectives or practices into your teachings?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's definitely a growth area for me, right? I'm always looking, I don't have all the answers when it comes to social justice, and I don't consider myself like an expert in the field or anything like that. I think it's really more of we all need to be putting a little more time and energy into learning more and about thinking about how we can reorient our curriculum and our actions around social justice. And I think just for, where I love especially in the U.S. history course, we get to sort of start that U.S. history course with, I sort of kick off my whole year there, sort of looking at indigenous wisdom, and looking at the influence of the Iroquois Confederation on our Constitution and our founding fathers, and like all the influences there, and which is not really part of the curriculum, right? Like technically that U.S. history course curriculum starts after the Civil War, which is like pretty crazy, right? It's like we're just going to skip that whole like slavery thing,
absolutely.
and a lot of indigenous people being displaced off their land, and then it circles back to it later, right, in the early 1900s and late 1800s with the reservation system and the Trail of Tears and But I think it's really important to sort of like go all the way back, sort of like thousands of years, and to like sort of and really looking at sort of the life ways of indigenous people. So that's one of my favorite places where that element really comes in, and then we can kind of keep referencing back to that as we move through U.S. history, and we get into some of our serious projects, the Creek Restoration Project. We're like, yeah, you know, we can look at some of the native plants that were used for basket weaving locally, and sort of how indigenous people sort of curated the landscape, right? It wasn't just all wild. Like they managed, like we said, talking with the fire practices or what plants and sort of things like that. And like the acorns, like the fire was a huge part of acorns, right? That first drop of acorns, and there's a lot of like bugs and pests and other things in them, and the duff. And so they'd usually let that first acorns fall, then burn through, and then they have like this nice clean forest floor for all the clean, fresh acorns to sort of gather on. And things like that. And there's just so many wonderful places. There's this great book that I find very inspiring called Braiding Sweetgrass.
I'm literally in the middle of reading that book right now.
So
it's wonderful.
It's so great. And I've read it, and I've listened to the audiobook too. Kimmerer, the author, she reads her own book in the audiobook. Wow. So you could actually listen to it in her voice, and it's like so soothing and relaxing. But yeah, it's just such a wonderful piece, you know, and it really shows that sort of that science, you know, and Western science and sort of modern science and indigenous knowledge don't have to be at odds, right? It's like we have this sense that they're this oppositional thing, and it's like, no, they're just different ways of talking about the natural world, right? And if we can sort of align them, it becomes so powerful, right? It's like science backed by indigenous knowledge is very powerful, and indigenous knowledge backed by science is very powerful. So I really look to that book as great inspiration in terms of how to get this sort of cultural perspective and historical perspective into our sort of scientific narrative.
Did you get any like pushback from the school or like students or anything about how you teach your curriculum, or has it been a pretty like welcoming environment?
Yeah, we are so lucky here. I mean, we have a very supportive administration, wonderful student body that, you know, will hang with you. And, you know, if the students are happy, the parents are usually happy. I mean, just parent night this year, I had all of my sort of Native American indigenous sort of books up on the board. And then when the parents came for, you know, back to school night or whatever, a lot of them, I got totally wonderful positive feedback. They're like, oh, I love these books. And I noticed you have all of these books, but you don't have that one. And a parent actually bought me like one book that I didn't have. And so
that's amazing.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is too attached to the way school's been taught for the past 100 years around here, right? It's, you know, it's great. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So like, I think it's really like interesting to hear that, well, not interesting, but it's awesome to hear that the community around you also supports, you know, your development of the curriculum that, you know, you're teaching to students. And I definitely felt as one of your former students that I gained a lot more out of learning not the whitewashed version of environmental science and of world or US history, and learning actual indigenous perspectives and stories from indigenous groups that, you know, show the true tragic nature of our history. And it's really great to hear that, you know, we get to incorporate all these new, or not new, but all these indigenous ideas and practices into the curriculum. And I believe we even used a little bit of their practices into our creek restoration, at least when I had that a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I also just want to like bring up, when we traveled to Spawn, which is essentially another organization that is in our area that deals with creek restorations on a professional level. Have they been using any indigenous practices or anything? Like, do you know if they intertwine the Western science with indigenous knowledge at all?
Yeah, you know, they do have some partnerships out in the valley, Spawn being the Salmon Protection and Watershed Network, the acronym there. And they do have some indigenous partners out there that sort of consult, you know, even their logo, you know, they did a new logo rebrand, and it's like the salmon with like kind of the mountains and the forest and the frog and the kind of stuff inside. That was actually drawn by a local indigenous artist. And so
Okay.
they do have those collaborations. And in terms of, it's in terms of creek restoration, it's really more, it's like indigenous peoples didn't have to do as much creek restoration because they hadn't developed and built all of, they hadn't channelized their creeks, and they didn't have all this concrete and golf courses and roadways and microplastics and all this stuff. Like they kind of had, their creeks were in a little bit more of a natural state, right? And they were subsisting off the salmon runs, right? Like when we sort of separated our food system from our creek system, that and sort of started viewing creeks more and rivers as sources of water for agriculture or electricity and dams, right? It's like that switch is really was just so devastating to native communities that were getting their sustenance from the salmon and all those ocean nutrients being transported up into terrestrial ecosystems. So really, when you think about the indigenous perspective influencing creek restoration, it's really just going back to thinking about creeks differently. Like, what is the role of this waterway? And it's not to divert water to agriculture, and it's not to generate electricity from hydroelectric dams, and it's not to store, drinking water for humans in reservoirs. So, I mean, pretty much at that point, any action you take in creek restoration sort of is like a return to an indigenous way of thinking about what these waterways perform for us. So, but I'm sure that there was a lot of indigenous management of that too, right? They had, they would sort of build their platforms out so that they could catch salmon coming up for the runs, and they would make sure that, barriers and stuff that fish were able to get over. If like a big tree or something rolled down and blocked a creek, they might have moved that to make sure that the salmon could get back to their spawning grounds and things like that. So
yeah,
awesome.
I think that like a stark difference between Western science and indigenous practices is that indigenous people just have so much better value and care for the intrinsic value of nature and of the ecosystem under consideration. Like you were saying, basically any practice that they're using to restore the creek is indigenous. It's because they understood like how to care for it, how to keep it healthy and alive, and not to obviously channelize water, which causes flooding and a ton of other issues to
it's just not a resource we can't use.
Yeah.
And they would definitely cultivate, right? It's like they had all these plants that were very useful to them in their life ways, particularly for basket making, but also clothing and tools and arrows and all these things, right? So, they would cultivate, they would bring plants in, and they would kind of they might clear some a particular species of plant and sort of plant the plants that they want to be growing there too. So it's not like it was all just sort of pristine, like they were still sort of working the landscape. But that just kind of shows that knowledge, right? They know that these types of plants are good for this, and they know that they grow well in the creeks, and so they sort of manage the ecosystem.
Yeah. So with your creek restoration, are you just trying to like clean up the area and take out plastics, or is there more to it?
Really, for us, it's our the two major problems that we face in our creeks here are invasive species, right? It's just ivy and all these, Himalayan blackberry and all these plants that should not be in the creek that, that sort of push out all of our native plants, and they don't hold the soil in as well. They have shallower root systems. So really, it's a lot of removal of invasive species and replacing those with native species that are going to be better at stabilizing the bank and supporting wildlife. I mean, ivy and blackberry, they just like they create, like rats like it, but they sort of create these dead zones. Whereas if you take those out and put in return with native species, you get a better blend of all sorts of critters. So that's the big part. And then the other big issue in our creeks around here is that we've developed up alongside them. So there's basically, we've channelized our creeks. We don't have natural floodplains or sort of the banks and turns that that a natural creek would. And so trying to kind of at least get restore as many areas that still do have sort of land and native plants and a buffer from the creek, just trying to make sure that we take really good care of those and plant them with good native plants so that they sort of hold and don't get washed away, basically because the channelization of the creek increases water velocity, and it causes a lot of erosion. So if we're not careful to sort of protect the good areas that we have left, they sort of get washed away too. And then they're like, oh, well, what's the Western modern solution to that? Is concrete. It's like, oh, well, this part of the creek is washing out, let's put concrete there. And it's like, no, that's going to make it worse. It's like it's the exact opposite of what we want to be doing. So that's, and really it's just the skills.
I feel like we've made at least some progress in the creek at RG, because haven't we seen salmon spawning coming back to the creek in these last year or two?
We
exciting, right?
saw Chinook come through the fourth quarter here in San Anselmo Creek for the, really the first time in decades that anyone has observed Chinook spawning there. And there's really very few historical records of them spawning at all. There's not really any hard numbers, but anecdotally, people a couple decades ago could tell you that they saw Chinook spawning here. And we had this big rain event, and lo and behold, that was enough water that the Chinook were able to get in, and we had just such a great time hanging out with students. I pretty much every day in my class, I just be like, all right, it's time to go like tiptoe over the creek and see how the Chinook are doing. And we just really got to see, so many of the things we talked about over years of creek restoration sort of out there, like came to life when we got to see it.
Yeah,
right in front of our eyes.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
it was cool.
Yeah, so I guess I would, before we talk about, or I'd just like to ask, that now that you've developed your knowledge of Indigenous practices of education, as you've matured as a person, and now you're an educator yourself, looking back on your forestry days, either with UC Berkeley, with one of the other corporations you worked for, like I believe Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management. Oh, that was UC Berkeley, excuse me. Or Natural Resources Management, or Turner Enterprises, whoever it may have been with. Is there any application of knowledge you have now that you wish you would have applied to your past jobs in terms of land management practices, like through Indigenous ideas or something of that kind, or sort?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll just briefly describe sort of what those three different positions were. So the Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Plant was a research forestry position through UC Berkeley. That was my first job. I was working on there was many different elements of that project, from wildlife. There was a whole fisher team that was out monitoring fishers and, doing like the endangered species stuff. There was water teams, hydrologists going out and doing all this waterway work. But I was on the fuels and wildfire management side of that team. So basically what we were doing was going out and collecting all this data around the forest where forest fires had been suppressed, right? So we had a lot of loading of fuels, dense trees, a lot of little trees kind of all overgrown, and sort of measuring how much fuel had stacked up in the woods around that stuff. And then, so we did that for like a whole summer and collected, hundreds of plots worth of data, all of that. And then the next summer, the next year, went out and we practiced, and they actually went back into some of the same areas that we collected data from and thinned it out, right? They took equipment in there and thinned out all the trees and increased the spacing, and do what we call fuel reduction, right? And so, what causes one element of catastrophic wildfires is the fire burning up into the canopy, right? And once you have a canopy fire, that fire is unstoppable, right? There's really not much you can do to stop a forest fire once it's in the canopy of the trees, which is why indigenous burning was so important, right? Because it would remove what we call ladder fuels, and it would, a lot of that fuel that would build up that would allow a fire to jump up into the canopy was now gone. So we sort of, use the modern sort of way of doing that would be to chip all the fuel. Like you come in, you take out all the trees, you remove the spacing, you cut all the branches, all the dead branches that are sort of low down that would allow the ladder fuel and the fire to move up into the canopy. You chip it all down, and so instead of having these big trees and logs that would burn very hot and intensely over a very long period of time, the fire can stay on the forest floor, because you chipped it all down and it'll burn faster and at less intensity. And so they measured, like we would do all these treatments in areas that were basically designed too, that if there was a catastrophic forest fire in that area, it would burn. And then there was like the managed areas where we shipped all the fuels and removed it and put fire breaks in, so that when the fire got there, the fire would fall out of the canopy and back onto the ground. And they were sort of put in these strategic areas where firefighters could sort of get there and set up and protect, basically to protect homes and other sort of things in mountain towns, right? And this is all before Paradise happened. This is all, but we knew it was a problem, right? And so, very literally, the treatments that we were doing were designed to prevent things like the Paradise fire, so that even if that catastrophic firefighter is burning towards Paradise, there'd be these breaks, strategic breaks, built in where it would drop the fire out and firefighters could fight it. So really important research and stuff there. But I didn't have that as much of the indigenous perspective. Like I was just coming at that from a fire science, Western sort of thing. And then realizing that what we were actually doing was mimicking indigenous management. That was the piece that I was missing then, and so fascinating now to kind of look back. And I was like, wow, I was doing this work and I was like pushing this sort of like return to a more indigenous way of life and management. I didn't even know it. So that's where like the most connection is, I would say there. Natural resource management, that was the cruise and timber. That was just like, how do you make money cutting down trees? So that one was a little not much going on there. Very Western and capitalist oriented. But then for Turner Enterprises, I got to sort of return back to that sort of dreamy environmental world. So that's with private forestry. Ted Turner, he's the media magnate, owns CNN, TNT. He has like the largest private landowner in the United States. He owns almost a full continuous strip of land from Canada to Mexico through the Rockies on these ranches. Yeah, really crazy stuff. And he leases out a ton of these ranches to fossil fuel companies, pumping natural gas and other in like fossil fuels and stuff out of his land. So the land is generating these huge amounts of money passively, right? He just collects royalties. He brings in other companies to extract the fossil fuels and he just collects a check. Right? And so, but thankfully he takes all that money and he puts it back into environmental causes. So when I was working for him, I did a couple different projects for him, but like instead of how do you make money out of this forest, his directive was how do you make this the healthiest, best forest you can for future generations? And he was thinking like in that same sort of indigenous perspective, how do we manage the forest now for 7 generations in the future? And that was his plan. He's like, I don't care if you make any money. I don't care how much this costs. I just want this forest to be the best it could be for future generations. And that was super cool. So I got to sort of return to like the dream of forestry. And I also did an endangered species work for him. There had a bunch of invasive fish that had gotten up into this lake system. And basically what we did is we built a fish barrier down at the bottom so that the invasive brook trout could no longer access the river system. And then we had to kill off all the invasive fish in the lake system. And then we reintroduced the native species with the fish barrier so that they could like survive in their own habitat. And it's just like, it's hugely expensive to do stuff like that. And the only reason you would do it is if you care about the environment. So Ted Turner's a really interesting character. He's like a Republican capitalist, very wealthy person, but very passionate about the environment, has poured millions and millions and millions of dollars into endangered species and water and forests. Like the desert tortoise, like he's like sponsored so much of this work on the endangered desert tortoise. There was one other big one. Oh, the bison. So I was on that ranch I worked at. There was elk herds, there was bison, and Yellowstone has that tribe, the herd of bison, but they're genetically isolated, and so they were having health problems in the Yellowstone bison herd. They actually called up Ted Turner and said, "Hey, we know you've got this really healthy bison population in New Mexico and the Mayhoe Park Ranch. Like, can we interbreed some of the Yellowstone bison in?" And so he's like doing work to restore one of our most like symbolic American animals and things like that. So there's like, once again, I was so not aware of the indigenous perspective around that. I was not, didn't know a lot about the local tribes then, but now sort of looking back, I can sort of think about, I was like, wow, like, I think we were doing good work. We just didn't know that it was, I didn't have that same perspective of this is indigenous land management, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't working with any indigenous people, right? They were not in charge. I worked with all white people on this ranch, and they were mostly, different backgrounds politically and socially than me too. So I felt like a fish out of water there sometimes, but very cool work.
Yeah.
I just loved living out there.
That's awesome.
I think it's pretty cool. Like close to the beginning of our discussion, you kind of touched on the idea that environmental science can bring people together kind of no matter what their political ideologies are. Like you just mentioned Ted Turner, I think was his name, who apparently is Republican, but he does good things as well, which is can be a little surprising sometimes. But I guess I'm just curious, like you personally, your environmental or social values, or even your political views, if you wish to go there, has your upbringing, either in the professional workforce or as a teacher or in college or whatever, influenced the way you think about politics and your political views?
Absolutely. I mean, as a social studies teacher, I consider myself a very political being, and I often say that for me, what really the big original push for me into social studies, into studying anthropology and caring about the environment really came from, I was a junior in high school when the September 11th attacks on the Twin Towers happened. And I was in a very conservative area, like outside of Bellingham, Washington. It's like, the city is very liberal there, but out as you sort of get further out in the county, it's much more of a conservative area. And that just really fractured our community out there, right? It's like you were on one side or the other, like you were pro-war or pro-invasion of Afghanistan or against. And it was so divisive and it was so awful. And I was sort of a young liberal. My parents were anti-war, and a lot of my friends from high school, the buddies I was played football with and stuff, that we had never talked about politics or anything. We were friends, we were teammates. And all of a sudden they're signing up and joining the Marines and shipping off to Afghanistan with machine guns. And I'm like, whoa, like this is not the world that I want to live in. And so it was that right there, I think, sort of set me down this path of like, wow, we got to like wake up here a little bit. Like we can't be just, angry at the rest of the world and invading places. And I was thinking about all the destruction and the death and all the oil that gets burned and these missiles. I'm just like, we're wasting all of our resources, like fighting over these silly things. And it just, there's a lot of repair in those relationships over the years that had to take place, right? We had to sort of reconcile these issues amongst ourselves that had never really divided us before. So I think I really carried that experience all the way through. It's like, I've always believed like we need to drop our political divisions. We need to learn how to talk to each other. We need to learn how to like unite around social justice and the environment, right? It's like, no one's going to be less happy if we have happier, healthier people in an environment, right? Like, but the way our society frames things, it's always a fight about economics or money, or it's like it gets viewed as like this, you can have environmentalism or capitalism or something. And it's like, it's such a false dichotomy, So I like to see the repair of divisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully environmental science is the path through that. So I think we only have probably one more question to ask you. That's something.
Yeah, just like as a final thought, like, what do you feel as though you've made an effective impact, like on your students and like people around you? And then also, like, I guess, what would you say to people who have that like doubt and gloom about the world?
Yeah, well, I would say like, you could get a very different answer to that question depending, from if you ask me today versus tomorrow or even this morning to this afternoon. Like sometimes, sometimes when the going gets tough and things aren't going quite how they planned, like sometimes I wonder, it's like I get that sort of negative feeling of like, God, is anything we're doing making a difference? Like,
yeah, totally.
And you just get frustrated and you wonder, it's just like, what should I be doing more? Like, is this the best way to spend my energies? And but I think it's really important, like everyone's going to feel those moments of doubt, right? And it's important to like remember, like, and go back to the successes and celebrate successes, right? I mean, just in that sort of vein, like we just wrapped up our energy project here in CDISC, and it was one of the most successful rounds to that project we've ever had. We had all these different teams working on these great issues. They were presenting to the school board about installing solar and using less water and revamping our garden and getting rid of single-use plastics on campus. And at first, it just seemed like it was this insurmountable task. We were getting a lot of resistance from admin. People were like, why are you guys doing this? And and we just kept pushing and we kept working. We kept our noses to the grindstone.
Nice.
And we're really seeing, we finally kind of cracked through, and we have all these meetings and plans for next year and with the district, and the school board has given us shout outs that, and town councils, and the mayor of Fairfax came to our Earth Day and was like celebrating some of the work we've done. And so it's like, it's just important to remember that even when it feels like tiny little baby steps or very incremental change, you just wonder if it's really making a difference in the grand scheme of things. It's like progress happens slow, it's things don't change overnight. And a lot of it has to do with just the attitude you bring, right? It's just like, you got to believe that it's worth it to fight for a better world. And I really do like to think that I have the energy and sort of the passion to carry that attitude. And I think more than anything, like, sure, you'll learn how to do creek restoration or how to measure water quality, or how to all the different things, like analyze a population chart or whatever. Like, we've learned all that stuff, and and I do believe we're sending kids with skills and knowledge to make the environment better. But I think more than anything, it's that perspective of we, through education and through indigenous wisdom and through hard work, we can make incremental change, right? And it's like, you just got to keep rolling. So I feel like, and I think Taryn is a great example, right? Of like that, it's like, you may not remember every little lesson from US history or government economics, right? But there was that perspective that we were able to carry forward. That's like, it's worth it. Like, we're worth it. The environment's worth it. Like, it's, where our children and our grandchildren are worth it, right? The cute little critters and bugs and birds and bees out there, they're worth it. And so we just, it's important not to let the doom and gloom kind of beat you down.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely speaking from someone who's in CDISC, if you asked me our freshman year of high school, what was I going to do when I grew up, I would have no answer for you. And then the second I joined CDISC, the perspective on the world just completely shifts after that. Like, that's when I started becoming an environmentalist, changed a lot of things about my life. Like, a lot of practices I do now are a lot different than I used to, like veganism, for an example. And I just think, like, overall, the impact that CDISC has on the students is like so much more than just like taking a regular simple like biology or science or environmental science courses, because it's like a community of people that you get to be with who all share your opinions and values, and you build off each other and you work together towards the incremental change that you were just talking about. And it's really great to feel that sense of support and community from those around you. And that's pretty much what shaped my college experience, at least as far as my major is concerned. Like, that's what I'm going to go off and do it the rest of my life. And I'm forever grateful for that.